see everybody again. It's kind of a cool night. And welcome to this building, of course, with the new carpets. Everybody see the new color carpets? Wow. My name is Mike Denham, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to tonight's January edition of the Florida Lecture Series produced by the LAWTON CHILES Center for Florida History. This really is a special night because we are partnering this program with Historic Lakeland Incorporated, which is a fine organization that I've been involved in for many years. And I want to take this opportunity to thank HLI for sponsoring this event and using it as a venue for their annual meeting. HLI was founded in 1979 as an organization to promote the appreciation of Lakeland's unique architectural heritage through awareness and engagement. HLI promotes preservation through education and awareness, and it has a large part in keeping our downtown so beautiful. Many of you that have lived here more than 20 years know how wonderful our downtown has become over the years, and a lot of it is due to the Historic Lakeland's involvement and so forth. Over the years, they've had a hand in saving the Lakeland Promenade, the Terrace Hotel, the New Florida Apartments, and many other iconic Lakeland landmarks. And it's a great organization, and I hope all of you will learn more about the organization by checking out the website, which is historiclakeland.org. And now I'd like to recognize HLI President John White. Is he nearby? Oh, there he is, okay. And also, while John's coming up to the microphone, I'd like to ask everyone in Historic Lakeland Incorporated as a member or a board member to stand, please.
Thank you, Mike. I think this is probably the fourth or fifth year we've coupled with the Florida Lecture Series for our annual meeting. It's always a fun place to come and share with the rest of the community some of the things that Historic Lakeland is doing. He was talking about our advocacy program. We saved the Lakeland LAWTON CHILES Middle School from becoming just being destroyed and then being replaced by the police department. We saved the old fire station downtown, and it was the Coca-Cola building, and they made sure that was preserved. We were the forefront with Gene Bunch and Mildred Guzard leading the way to, and Juanita Black, to make sure the Lake Muir Promenade was brought back to the pleasurable lakes you can see today. Subsequently, we've had the Hollis Gardens be added to it, and of course the Barnett Park downtown. They built the new venue for Peggy Brown. The Peggy Brown building came because that whole park was recognized as being a real asset for downtown. And then if you were here earlier, David Bunch was telling us about the work that was done to bring about Bonnet Springs Park, which is becoming our central park for Lakeland now. And if you haven't visited, though 500,000 of us have been there, please go visit Bonnet Springs Park. It's a beautiful venue that really is more like a central park in downtown Lakeland, just west of downtown, and where the old railroad tracks used to be. That's all I really had to say. There are membership envelopes on the front table up here if you would like to join Historic Lakeland. And or just, sign on to the website, as he said. Thank you.
Before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to tell you a little bit about a few things we have upcoming in February and March. On February 16th, we'll welcome musician and FSC alum Rick Norcross, who will share his memories of the music scene here in Polk County in the 1960s and 70s. And many of you know that Polk County has a rich music heritage, including Graham Parsons and Bobby Braddock and a whole host of other people. And Mr. Norcross was actually a student here and was in that mix and ended up becoming a professional musician. And he's had a long career. So he's going to be in the Branscombe Auditorium on February 16th, and he's going to do a little talking, a little singing, a little playing, and he's going to share with us also his covering of the music industry in Tampa in the 1970s. And many of you know about all those shows they had over in Tampa. I can remember some, but I'm not going to talk about some of those shows that I went to over there. Anyway, and then on March 16th, music will again be the subject when we focus on the Beatles. That's right, the Fab Four were in Florida in 1964 for 2 weeks. And during 1964, and Good Day Sunshine is the topic or the title of a book written by Bob Keeling, who many of you remember his books on Graham Parsons and also on Elvis. And he's spoken here before, and he's a great speaker. And that's going to be March 16th on the Florida Lecture Series brochure. It's 18th, but again, it's 16th, which is a Thursday night. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Claire Strom was born in Boston, but grew up in Cambridge, England. After graduating from Oxford University, she moved back to the United States, finding her way to studying agricultural history at Iowa State. She earned her PhD degree in agricultural and rural history. After teaching stints at the University of Wisconsin and North Dakota State, she joined the Rollins College faculty in 2008 as the Rapetti-Trunzo Chair of History at Rollins College. For many years, she served as editor of Agricultural History, which is the premier journal, academic journal for agricultural history. And she is the winner of the Gladys Baker Lifetime Achievement Award from the Agricultural History Society. The honor recognizes her more than 25 years of outstanding scholarship and community building in the field of rural and agricultural history. Since coming to Rollins, she has taught many courses, and more than that, though, has mentored a lot of students in faculty-student collaborations. She works jointly with students on books and articles, as well as classes about the Orlando Winter Park area. So she's familiar with a lot of the same kind of things that Historic Lake Incorporated, of course, is doing. Her most well-known book is the subject of tonight's evening's program, which is entitled Making Catfish Bait Out of Government Boys. Making Catfish Bait Out of Government Boys. The Fight Against Cattle Ticks and the Transformation of the Yeoman South. And I'm not going to go into some of the details of the descriptions of this murderous history. I'm just going to say welcome to Claire, and help me welcome Claire Strom to our stage.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I don't think I'm quite tall enough, but we'll see. I worked on this project quite a while ago, and when Mike asked me to come and speak to you, I started looking at it and realized that it has relevance now as it probably didn't have when I was working on it 10, 12 years ago, because it really deals a lot with issues of public health and individual freedom versus community safety. So I think maybe we all have some more interest in these topics than we did a few years ago. So, I'm sorry these images are so small, but there you go. So, one Saturday morning, almost exactly 100 years ago today, Man Carter and his son Will set out from their house in the piney woods of Eccles County, Georgia, to look for a missing blue sow. Rumor had it that the sow was at one of their tenants' homes. As always, they took their guns and a bird dog, and as they walked, they did a little shooting. Not far from their house, they were hailed from the main road by Roy Ritchie, who was a federal employee in the local tick eradication program. Joining him and his partner, Max Lockridge, by their Ford, the four men discussed one of Man's heifers that had been seized and quarantined because of tick infestation. The conversation seemed calm and pleasant. No voices were raised, and Lockridge smoked a cigarette. As everyone readied to move on, Mann turned to the inspectors and asked, "Are you fellas going to turn my cow loose?" When Lockridge replied no, Mann shot half of his face away, killing him instantly. Ritchie fled into the woods and escaped, although he was wounded in the back by birdshot. The Carters retreated into the swamp, leaving the dead body next to the car, along with a Chesterfield cigarette butt. Naturally, different people remember this story differently, but even Mann and Will Carter acknowledged that they shot Lockridge and Ritchie. Despite this, neither man was ever charged with murder or manslaughter. So what I want to explore tonight is why these men were never charged with their crime and why there was all this violence surrounding ticks and cattle. Babesiosis went by many names, but it is a cattle disease caused by a protozoan, which is on the left there, which is transmitted by a cattle tick. It was endemic in the American South from at least the 18th century on. So this is the line of infestation. Above the line, it was too cold for the cattle ticks to survive year in, year out, so it wasn't a problem. Beneath the line, the cattle ticks lived year-round, and so the cattle always were infested. It didn't cause great hardship to southern cattle or farmers, but if the southern cattle infected non-exposed northern cattle, the death rate could be as high as 90%. The advent of the cattle trailing industry around the Civil War made this problem apparent as southern herds infected northern herds with dire consequences. Indeed, along the borders in Missouri and Illinois, northern farmers would sometimes meet the trailing cattle with shotguns and turn them back because they didn't know why these cattle killed their cattle, but they did know they killed them. Nothing could be done, however, until the etiology of the disease was determined. So in 1889, going back to this slide, Theobald Smith and Fred Kilbourne of the US Department of Agriculture figured out that the infecting agent was the protozoa carried by the tick. And actually, this was the first time that any disease that was carried by another insect had been figured out, right? So an insect that bites you and puts a disease into you. So after this, malaria was figured out, a lot of diseases, human diseases were figured out, but this was the first one. So in 1906, Congress appropriated funds to eradicate the cattle tick. So rather than try to figure out how to cure the disease, how to deal with the protozoa, they went straight to the idea that they would eradicate the tick. Now, what this involved, and I think some of you in the room know this more than me, was it involved farmers having to dip all their cattle in arsenic, not a good thing, every 2 weeks during the spring or summer until the county was judged tick-free. And that could take years. So you could be doing this for 5 or 6 years every 2 weeks. So, why oppose eradication? So the people that were in favor of eradication generally fell into several buckets. There was the state and federal governments, scientists, well-to-do farmers who hoped to make money raising cattle in the South and selling them in the North, or bringing blooded cattle into the South to improve their herds. They couldn't do that because those cows just died. And this is especially true after the onset of World War I, when beef was at a premium. However, the very nature of the disease and of ticks meant that everyone had to eradicate, not just the people that were in favor of it. All ticks needed to be killed in order to prevent reinfestation. So initially, counties were allowed to decide themselves whether they wanted to be involved. But the consequence of this was that New South regions worked on the problem, while yeoman farmers did not, which led to continual reinfestation. Now, The scientists and the government saw the yeoman farmers as ignorant, but actually they had good reason to oppose the problem, to oppose the eradication. For many rural people, living with nature in an intimacy that's no longer common, the idea of eradicating such a ubiquitous pest was ridiculous. William Benjamin Franklin Townsend, a newspaper editor in northern Georgia, often expressed this view in his paper. He wrote that, I quote, "We have had ticks here ever since the foundation of the world, and we will have until that shower of fire and brimstone comes." Now, although scientists at the time, caught up in progressive stances, belittled these country people for their opinions, history has generally sided with the yeoman. Although we have had some success eliminating such diseases as polio and TB, the scientific establishment has had much less luck against fire ants, gypsy moths, mosquitoes. In fact, the eradication of the cattle tick itself proved unrepeatable in other countries such as Australia, South Africa, and in Latin America. Yeoman also resented the time the program ate up. Many of these people lived in free-range areas of the South, which means that there were no fences. So the cattle and hogs ran free, grazing on public land. Often these farmers did not have the land themselves to afford to put the cattle and hogs on. So the only way they could keep these animals was if they ran on the free land. Although free range had been common in the South in the early 19th century, after the Civil War, it's gradually replaced with fence laws. So those were laws on a county basis that said you had to fence your animals. Plantation owners who were eager to protect their crops promoted fencing, and also, importantly, the railroads wanted fencing because the railroads kept killing cows and hogs on the railroad line, and then they had to pay to replace them. And if you were a smart farmer and had an old cow, you would put it on the railroad line and then say that it was this perfect young heifer, and the railroad owed you all this money. So the railroad is like, let's get those cows fenced. So the areas that survive as free range were marginal. They're ill-suited to large-scale cash cropping. So it's the mountains, Appalachia, it's the swamps, we have some of those here, and the piney woods up in North Florida and South Georgia. Or the areas that were not fully developed at the beginning of the 20th century, like Florida, which in 1934 still had 700,000 unfenced range cattle. So this is where the yeoman lived. So in these counties, the proposition of dipping cattle every 2 weeks had a very different connotation from elsewhere. The farmers didn't have to just drive their cows to the vats, they had to find them. And they had to find them in a landscape that wasn't easy. Yeomen living on the edge often resented the effort and time taken to round up their cows. So as Man Carter testified at his trial, it was quite a job to get my cattle up every 14 days to be dipped. It would take 3 or 4 men. We would start at the first of the week, and it would take us all week. So somebody who has a mixed economy income is spending half his time rounding up cattle for dipping. Another example, in the 1930s, when the USDA was working around Wauchula dipping cattle, a federal crew managed to round up 50 cows in a week from a head of 33,000. So this is not easy. Another problem for the yeoman was that the dipping was dangerous. The cattle, as you can see here, were forced to swim through a vat of arsenic, and in the middle they were hit on the head with a pole to dunk them completely under. Now, if you hadn't watered the cows beforehand, or hadn't watered them sufficiently, they would drink the arsenic and die. If somebody screwed up the solution and it was too strong, and this is kind of gross, so I'm sorry, the cattle's hides would shrink on them and they die. So all cows, obviously, were vulnerable to these problems, but the wealthier stock owners had several options that the yeoman did not. They could replace lost stock, because they had the money, and they could also build private vats on their land and hire someone to make sure that the dipping was done properly. Yeoman also faced another problem that the wealthier farmers didn't. Their animals are running wild in forests and swamps and are unused to human contact. So being rounded up and roomed to the vats really stressed these animals, and they often panicked, resulting in injury and sometimes death. Another reason that the yeoman opposed the program was because it cost a lot of money. In most states, the funding came from two places, the federal government and individual counties, with the state government contributing little. And what the counties were responsible for was building and maintaining the dipping vats and buying the chemicals and hiring local tick inspectors. So in New South areas, this cost was pretty minor. Wealthy farmers often built their own vats and let their neighbors use them. And wealthy counties tended to be more densely populated, so there was a bigger tax base anyway. In the yeoman counties, it was a different story. These counties could barely meet their regular expenses, which were paupers, criminals, road repairs, and official salaries. Adding a new cost was prohibitive. As Man Carter said, Eccles County is broke, and she won't spend any money. I don't know when counties got to be female, but apparently they are. The final reason, I think is the most important, yeoman farmers were not going to see any benefit from this program. Unlike the New South farmers, they did not want to ship their cattle up north or improve their herd with blooded stock. I mean, you don't want to put a purebred heifer out in the Okefenokee swamp, right? Like, that's just stupid. You want a really tough cow. They usually just had enough animals for family use, and if, like Man Carter, they were raising extra for sale, they were just selling them locally. Consequently, yeoman farmers in the counties where they predominated chose not to engage in the federal eradication program. They recognized it was not in their interests, and they exercised their grassroots power and opted out. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how they opted out, because after a few years, that was no longer a choice. After a few years, the federal government realized that it had to be all or nothing, and they decided on all. So many yeomen launched a variety of protests. These protests were varied in their methods and legalities, and they all represented long-standing means of political action, most of which had roots stretching way back into the colonial era. Deciding on what course of action you were going to take was highly personal, and at any one time, many different forms of resistance were occurring throughout the South. In fact, there's a guy up in North Carolina who's been doing some new work on the tick eradication program, who calls it the most violent, unknown war in American history. And I don't think he's wrong. Some farmers settled down and dipped their cows after one type of opposition failed, others upped their ante. Probably the most passive form of protest was through letters, and people wrote letters complaining about tick eradication to powerful politicians, including the president. Many people wrote to the president, and some got together in groups and outlined their grievances in petition form. Petitions had emerged in England in the Anglo-Saxon times as a way for groups or individuals to ask for redress of wrongs. Of course, as the American colonies had no representation in Parliament, petitioning went across the Atlantic really quickly and was much used by colonial Americans and their governments to air their grievances. The right was considered so important by the new nation that it became part of the First Amendment. The petitions regarding dipping usually outlined the problems and asked for exemptions, and they were very logical. They explained some of the things that I've just been talking about. So, for example, a group of petitioners in Ardmore, Oklahoma wrote, "Cows that are closely confined in a small lot in town cannot be moved from 1 to 4 miles to mix with other cattle, to fight more or less, and be in a mix-up of boys and dogs and men on horseback without being more or less damaged in every instance." None of these petitions was successful. In every case, the government, they weren't even sympathetic. They just wrote back and said, "Sorry, you've got to dip your cows." Another form of protest was to challenge the laws that required people to dip their cattle. Yeoman did this in a number of ways. Some worked as individuals and just refused to obey the law, and then when they were arrested, took their case to court. These farmers were often prominent men in their communities, described by journalists as things like a well-known farmer, or one of Macon's best-known citizens. These farmers wanted to challenge the validity of the law. That's what they were doing. One such case was that of John Rowland of Johnson County, Georgia. Rowland was about 71 years old when he went to court. He was a white farmer who owned his land and home, so he's pretty wealthy. He claimed that he only owned milk cows for family consumption, and that these cows were clean of ticks and were kept on his land with no access to potentially ticky animals. So he didn't see why you should dip them. The cows were seized by the tick inspector, and Rowland filed suit on the basis that the state tick law, this is the Georgia state law, was unconstitutional. According to Rowland, the law violated both the 14th Amendment, requiring that he had due process, so he thought he should have been given a chance to discuss this before his cattle were seized, and the state constitution, which protected private property. The judge in the Superior Court of Georgia ruled against him. He appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, which also ruled against him. This ruling graphically illustrates the political danger that the yeoman farmers saw in the tick laws. These people had largely been left alone by the government, any government, to govern themselves and their communities. The implementation of tick eradication resulted in a massive intrusion of external power. Instead of controlling the well-being of their own communities and its members, a seemingly alien and dictatorial power was removing their right of self-protection. In Rollins' case, the Supreme Court judge's opinion basically asserted, and this is where we come down to public health versus individual power, that the state's rights were superior to that of the individual. He said that the due process was not designed to interfere with the police power of the state to prescribe regulations to protect the health of people. So public health is more important than individual freedom. Secondly, he stated that given the potential of a ticky cow to reinfest other livestock, the animal was considered a nuisance, and so as such could be abated without compensation to his owners. In many respects, this case embodies one of the key debates surrounding tick eradication, the extension of governmental, especially federal authority. Scientists, progressive leaders, and other advocates of eradication, intent on improving the quality of stock, saw the laws that gave them the power to do so as a necessity. Yeoman, on the other hand, believed these laws not only undermined their economic status, but infringed on their liberty. As Governor Sidney Katz of Florida said, farmers should, and I quote, protect themselves against federal trespassers so long as their trigger finger would operate a six-shooter. You can guess this went well in Florida. Along with contesting the validity of tick eradication laws, farmers challenged the program by using extant laws that defended persons and property, laws that they held great appeal to the yeoman. During the course of the program, tick inspectors were constantly being arrested for theft. So they would go onto somebody's land, they would say, this is a ticky cow, you have to dip it, and the farmer would say, I'm not going to dip it, so the inspectors would say, okay, well, we're going to take the cow away, and they would take the cow away, and then the farmer would get the sheriff to arrest the tick inspector for theft. Now, these cases never went anywhere, but they certainly delayed things. So one of my favorite stories about this was in 1925, some range riders in Franklin County, Arkansas, came upon an undipped bull. So they took it to the vat, they dipped it. They identified the owner, it was a guy called Bell Jordan, and they notified him that he had to come and get his bull and presumably pay a fine. Jordan didn't show up. So the riders take the bull, and it was described in the local paper as more like an antiquated buffalo, so I think this is probably a pretty good picture, into town, and they put this bull up for sale. A local justice at that point issued a warrant for grand larceny, and 4 of the federal employees and 2 deputy sheriffs were arrested. Getting to more interesting methods of opposition, either concurrently with legal methods or instead of them, you see an awful lot of violence as ways to try and dissuade counties and authorities from dipping cows. In some cases, farmers took advantage of their personal association with neighbors who were cooperating with county officials or who had been hired as state or federal inspectors to threaten them. Now, I told Mike that I was going to swear, but it's all quotations. I could swear otherwise if you would like, but I'll stick with quotations for now. So these men, these federal tick inspectors, received letters promising everything from blowing your home to fragments, to giving you hell some way, you son of a bitch, to my favorite, which was they would just nail pictures of coffins on these people's doors. In several cases, the way we know this is in several cases people forward these letters onto Washington, D.C., to the USDA, so there's a small percentage, I'm sure, in the file. Threats and threatening letters play a part of the Eccles County case. Several people, testifying for the prosecution, of course, remember Man Carter saying of the tick agents, and you've heard this quote before, "We will get them. We will put them in the river and make catfish bait out of them." Another witness remembered a group of men approaching the federal tick camp, there were such things, and the quote is, "They were hollering," and I should have Mike read this because he's got the accent for it. "They were hollering and saying, 'I will shoot their goddamn lights out, you goddamn cow-ticking sons of bitches.'" The year before Lockridge was shot, a group in Eccles County, calling themselves, I kid you not, the Red Devils, wrote to J.C. Jeter, a federal inspector who actually stayed with the program and ended up down around here somewhere. And they wrote to him and they said, "We want to warn you to take your family and leave Eccles County. We understand your only mission here is to dip and spray cattle. We don't intend to do either. A hint to the wise is sufficient." They also wrote to Jeter's landlord and said they would dynamite the house if Jeter continued to live there. Now, the main thing that went on here was dynamiting. There were a couple of murders, including the one we talked about at the beginning, but most of the violence was directed at property rather than person. And most of it took the form of dynamiting dipping vats. And this served two purposes. It was very smart. First of all, the sheer force of the explosion made a considerable impact. So some of you have lived in the rural South, and some of you lived in the rural South before devices and things making noise, when maybe you had a radio. But if you imagine lying in bed one night and suddenly there's these explosions all around, I mean, you would notice, right? It would get your attention. So it brings media attention, the newspapers would write about it, so it brings attention to the cause. At the same time, destroying dipping vats had a very real financial cost. So we talked about how the counties had to pay for them. Well, if you dynamite them, then the county has to pay for it again. And dynamite was cheap. You could just keep dynamiting those things, and the county would have to keep rebuilding them. And what would happen, in some cases, is finally the county would say, "We just can't do this. We just do not have the money." And return to the state and federal government and say, "I don't know what you want me to do, or us to do." And at the same time, the farmers going to that dipping vat now had to go further to dip their cattle, so that's putting more stress on them and maybe making them think that the program is worthless. And dynamite was also cheap, right? In the early 20th century, dynamite was readily available and farmers could use it to grub up stumps, as is going on here, dig ditches, and straighten streams. It could take place under the cover of darkness. It could represent a large coordinated resistance. Often you see one or two vats being dynamited, but I found in eastern Alabama, one county had 67 vats dynamited in one night. So, I mean, nobody got any sleep, right? It was quite a thing. And this guy in North Georgia has been doing some newspaper work on all the dynamiting, and he has much better numbers than I do. Another method used to delay the process was assault. In Florida in 1926, one Dr. Moline visited a Mr. Stevens of Walton County to persuade him to dip his cattle. According to the inspector, Stevens became very angry and started to procure a gun to shoot Dr. Moline. So Moline tackled Stevens and held him down while the state riders took and quarantined the cows. Stevens was arrested and charged with assault, so in return, he charges Moline with assault. So, what happens is this just gums up everything. What's super interesting, or at least is to me, is remember this is all going on just after World War I in the 1920s, and so there's a lot of people who have military experience, and you have an army that just was at war and has a lot of stuff, right? So dynamiting led tick inspectors to arm themselves and their equipment. So in numerous trouble spots, the government actually established quasi-military camps, and they were often supplied by the Department of War. In these camps, federal tick inspectors, who were often, like Roy Ritchie, a World War I vet, manned machine guns that were mounted on the dipping vats to try and ensure that the program was carried out. Of course, you can imagine what happened here. When tick inspectors were armed, more people were injured. So in the early 1920s, dipping virtually reaches a standstill in Amite County, Mississippi, because of the number of vats dynamited. By early June, the local inspector, a guy called O'Neill, had set 2 of his range riders to guard the vats as well as riding the range. On the morning of June 2nd, O'Neill's nephew, who's only 20, Knox O'Neill, was watching the vat located 200 feet from the courthouse. Sometime after 2 in the morning, 5 men approached the vat, supposedly to dynamite it. Knox challenged them, and he called halt, because that's what he meant to say, right? In response, one of the men said, "Halt hell," and cocked his pistol. So Knox fired, and he wounded one man, and the others ran away. The sheriff, an elected official, had kind of a balancing act to do because the county was very against tick eradication. So what he did was he arrested 2 of the dynamiters, supposed dynamiters, and Knox O'Neill, who was released on a $1,000 bond. The situation becomes a little more tricky when the farmer, a guy called Henry Pruick, died. So now it's murder. The feeling of the county, solidly against tick eradication, a grand jury indicted Knox for murder. And I love this. This sounds like my students, actually. The argument of the farmers involved went like this. They had no intention of dynamiting the vat. They were just passing by in search of liquor, when suddenly, without warning or provocation, Knox fired on them, killing Henry. Of course, when the case goes to trial, finally, the story was easily demolished. Dynamite was found at the scene, abandoned after the men had fled. Pruick was lying next to a cocked pistol. Additionally, perhaps most damningly, before he died, Pruick spoke to the sheriff and said that he came to blow up the vat and kill the goddamn guard, but he got me first. So Knox was found innocent and moved to Arizona, far away from piney woods and ticky cows. So unfortunately for the Yeoman, the federal government remained committed to this idea of tick eradication and determined to succeed, regardless of the fiscal, human, or economic cost. So they changed laws to eliminate loopholes, they arrested people, tried people, convicted people, and even states, we'll get to Florida in a minute, that refused to comply with strong-armed. So in some areas, Yeoman failed at a county level. This is what happened in Eccles County. After the Carters were arrested, although they weren't charged with murder, tick eradication was just forced through. And it was just done like that. In other areas, like Louisiana, Yeoman dynamited so many vats that counties just had to opt out. This meant they were taken to court for breaking state laws, but they had no financial means to comply, so there wasn't a lot that could be done. And similarly, in Florida, the opposition was so intense that the federal government finally threw up its hands and said that they weren't even going to try to eradicate ticks in Florida. It was just too hard. So what they did in Florida, which I think is kind of brilliant, was they just quarantined the whole state. So in the late 1920s, the only market for Florida cattle, and a lot of Florida cattle, was Cuba, which was itself a cattle exporter. That kind of screwed up things. In these states, there was a hard internal battle as the New South, who wanted to get their states reopened, fought the Yeoman. And what made the difference was the Great Depression. And I mean, the federal government should have figured this out way before the Great Depression. But with the Great Depression and the New Deal and the need to give people money, the federal government had the brilliant idea, well, let's pay farmers to dip their cattle. Well, now the farmers are like, sure, where do you want me to dip them? Lead me to it. And then they start hiring these farmers as inspectors. So it was all wonderful. It was all great. So the yeomen dipped their cows. So by the early 1940s, the cattle tick was mainly eradicated in the continental United States, although it still existed in Puerto Rico. In Florida, however, the tick found a haven on the state deer. Nobody knew that they could live on deer, but apparently they could. So during the late 1930s, there was a federal state program which actually worked to eradicate all the deer in Florida. It was actually quite successful. They did a really good job, except they ran into a problem with the Seminole Reservation. Because, as you know, Indian reservations are not state land, and the Indians have autonomy on them. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a man called John Collier, who was a great proponent of Native Americans, refused to let the deer on the reservation be slaughtered. He said that it was vital for the Native American diet. His boss, Secretary of the Interior, a man, I love this name, called Harold Ickes, concurred. So what you get, which again I love, is a turf war during World War II between the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture, and they're both writing to FDR asking for his help. Finally, FDR got so pissed off that he wrote back to the Secretary of Agriculture, and I quote, "Do you really insist that I take this matter up with Prime Minister Churchill and with Mr. Stalin and with the Generalissimo?" At that point, everyone behaved themselves. Ultimately, the United States was the only large nation to successfully eradicate babesiosis. The only other nation to do it at all was Cuba. Certainly, this was a huge triumph of progressive science and a boon to the livestock industry. But from the 21st century perspective, perhaps the benefits look somewhat less. On a positive side, the South was able to raise high-quality stock. However, most of the region never met the prediction of becoming a substantial livestock economy. Think about Alabama or Mississippi. Exceptions, of course, Texas and Florida. In addition, southern cattle, which actually suffered very little from babesiosis, were free from ticks, which could cause debilitation. So this, again, sorry about the grossness, is a cow's hide covered in ticks. So, like, if you had that many ticks, you were not going to be doing well. Additionally, livestock in the rest of the country was safe from infection and death and from the disease, although with the demise of the trailing industry, that was less of an issue. On the flip side, the program was only achieved at huge cost. It was tremendously expensive. It reduced the amount of self-sufficiency in the South, as many yeomen dealt with the hardship and cost of the program by getting rid of the family milk cow, and it contributed to rural flight from the land. The eradication program has also cost the government considerable money, even to this day, because Mexico still has the cattle tick. So you have river riders, this is a guy I interviewed, who ride up and down the border with Mexico looking for stray animals. And then when they find them, they have to rope them and what they call scratch them for ticks. And then if they find them, they treat them with an acaricide. It's not arsenic anymore, thank God, but they've gone through several other solutions. The government now estimates that if a major outbreak of babesiosis happened in America, the cost would be astronomical. So perhaps the yeomen were right. Perhaps the program wasn't worth the cost. In countries such as Australia, where scientists were unable to eradicate the tick in the first half of the 20th century, they've developed different methods of dealing with the disease. They make sure their calves are infested early to gain immunity, and they keep a controlled population of ticks in the pastures so that their animals maintain the immunity. They also have other tactics, put chickens in with the ticks to eat in with the cows to eat the ticks and things like that. And the Australian stock industry has maintained this less invasive and much cheaper policy successfully for over half a century. So what happened to Man and Will? Well, after escaping into the swamp and hiding out with family, they were finally arrested by the sheriff. The county's grand jury, however, refused to indict them on murder, which made the government officials from the state to the federal level apoplectic. I mean, people who didn't even know Eccles County existed were writing about it. So what happened was the federal officers found this charge and they arrested the two men on it, and it is the charge of interfering with a federal tick inspector in his duties. I guess permanently interfering. So this opened the door for the Carters to contest this, and they said, aha, but the federal tick inspectors had no legal duties in the county, so this opens the whole can of worms. And they contested all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is why I have so much detail of the story. Here, their last appeal was overturned in the mid-1930s, so it takes over 10 years, and they go to jail. Will serves 5 years before being arrested and moving back to Eccles County, where he lived out his life. Man actually served less. He was sentenced to 10 years, but he was released after 3 to go home and die. So, that's my story. Thank you. I'm sure you have dipping bats around here. They have one on the UCL campus. In fact, I get calls periodically from schools and from states asking if I know where all the bats are located, because the arsenic seeps into the soil. So they don't want to build on that land, so they don't know where they all were.
I'm not sure we have a microphone circulating out there, but if anybody has a strong cattle voice, they can ask a question. Yes. Wow.
I happen to know where there is an old cattle vat. Is that, it's way in the woods. Is there any value in getting historical knowledge of that vat?
The state might like to know where it is, or the county, because they are dangerous. They try not to put kindergartens on them or things like that. There's a couple on UCF's campus.
Lyme disease, Babesia, Ehrlichia, and the other tick-borne human difficulties. Does this have any bearing on what we're doing now with those diseases?
Not really. Humans can get babesiosis, this disease. It's usually, in fact, I had a friend who had it. It's usually carried by a rodent tick for humans. But the way that we try to mitigate tick-borne diseases now is more to address the disease, how it manifests in the body, rather than trying to eliminate the cause. I think it was very optimistic to assume you could eradicate something like a tick. It's amazing they did it, really.
There's another loud voice back here.
I can't help but but find it ironic in thinking about what we've just been through with the pandemic and federal laws versus local states that oppose them. It seems to me there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, I mean, when I was going through this, I hadn't looked at this material since before COVID, so it was like, oh, yes, actually, this has more relevance than it did 5 years ago. Because it's a similar argument, right? I mean, there were a lot of economic arguments opposing shutdown, and they were good arguments, but there were also good scientific arguments why shutdown was a good thing. So it's a very similar situation, and got equally heated. And Florida was also at the epicenter. So many comparisons.
It's a great book, mix of science, social history, violence, cattle. It's just got, it's a great book.
Okay. Your wife.
My wife.
As I was listening to you, I actually was thinking more of the greening disease in citrus. And that you see a correlation between, I mean, they had to eradicate all these roads because of that. That could not have been a welcome.
No, and I think, I think the big difference there is that for the yeoman, I mean, they were really subsistence farmers, right? So they were really a powerless group where citrus has always had some clout. And it was their first foray into politics, and you read some of these petitions and they're quite sad because they're so naive. They feel like if they explain this to you, you will understand and you will stop it. And they're writing to, you have these little old ladies with like one cow writing to the president and being like, I can't get out of the house and get to the dipping vat. And I know you won't make me do this, Mr. President. And they get an answer from some pencil pusher going, dip your cow.